On base open days, the flight line smells like grilled onions, hot breaks, and sun-baked concrete. Families wander between static displays, kids climb into cockpits they'll remember for the rest of their lives, and the loudest tent belongs to the K-9 unit. That's where the crowd gathered, half expecting a circus, half hoping for a little danger they could clap for. Staff Sergeant Cole Ramirez gave them both. He stood square-shouldered with a tight leash in a tighter jaw, one hand on the harness of Raptor, 100 pounds of Belgian Malinois in pure intent. Ma'am, with all due respect, step away from the dog. You're an admin clerk, not a handler. The microphone made his voice bigger than he was. People at the back turned. People at the front smirked. Raptor felt the change and fed off it, ears pinned, hackles up the quick saw cut of breath. That means a dog is building more energy than he can safely store. The woman who'd drawn the warning didn't argue. She wore a crisp uniform without fuss, Senior Airman Dana Reed on her tape, personnel on her duty roster. At least that's what anyone peeking at her badge could read. She didn't clutch her hands or blurt an apology. She just stood balanced, feet planted like the floor belonged to her, hands low and open, breathing slow enough to calm a room. It was the kind of stillness most folks miss because it isn't loud. From the shade near the hangar door, Master Sergeant Hank Lawson watched with a face that looked carved rather than grown creases from long nights' pale scars that didn't come from office furniture. Lawson had been a handler when Raptor's grandparents were pups. He'd known men who could quiet a storm and men who could start one by walking in. He'd seen the stance on Reed before in a different country, under a different flag, in a corridor where silence and timing mattered more than rank. Ramirez made a show of control because he still believed control had to look like something. Folks, we're going to demonstrate a felony takedown, he said, chest out for the crowd. No one crosses the line. Ma'am, seriously, back up. Reed didn't move. She watched the dog's eyes, not his teeth. That told Lawson everything. The crowd leaned for a better view. The demo dummy old camo stuffed with rags lay 20 feet out, duct tape knife in its rubber hand. Between the harness and the dummy were 3 steps of good sense and a leash full of error. Ramirez gave the pre-brief commands in English, then German, clipped and loud. Raptor boiled higher. Someone laughed nervously, and that sound, thin and human, snapped like a twig in a campfire. The dog surged. The leash burned across Ramirez's glove. The line went bowstring tight. Hey, Ramirez barked, hauling back, voice pitched just high enough to tell Lawson what the bike already knew. The handler was riding his own adrenaline. Reed took one smooth step forward and went to one knee. It wasn't dramatic. It was deliberate. Hands still open, palms up, she made herself small, without making herself timid. Then she said a single word, in Old German, the kind that lives in the margins of dog training manuals you can't check out of a base library. Lawson heard it and felt his shoulders drop. Raptor heard it and shut down. The change wasn't magic. It was physics, biology, and memory all pulling in the same direction. The dog's growl died like someone had put a hand over the top of a ringing bell. The pull on the leash softened. The massive head tilted a fraction. Then with a chuff that sounded almost embarrassed, Raptor sat. He lowered his muzzle, nosed Reed's open hand, and leaned into her palm like a child presses into his mother's coat in a crowded store. The cheer didn't come. The crowd's first response was silence, the sharp, quivering kind a room gets right after something falls and doesn't break. You could hear metal buckled tongues clink against the ring on Raptor's collar. You could hear Reed breathe. You could hear Ramirez's pride shatter and scatter under his boots. That's not possible, he said, too low for the speaker to catch. Reed didn't look up at him. She wasn't avoiding the handler so much as refusing to steal a moment from the dog. Raptor pressed harder, searching for her sleeve with a persistence that was not affection so much as a ritual. When his nose found the edge, he mouthed it gently and tugged. The cuff slid an inch. Something darker than fabric ink, dark and purpose-built, showed beneath. Lawson moved before anyone else's mind had caught up to their eyes. He stepped around a stroller, cut through a gap in the tape line, and walked down the demo lane like it belonged to him. Up close, he could see the tattoo, a coiled sea beast, kraken, or serpent wrapped around a double-edged trident, the steel stylized with the kind of detail you don't find in strip mall art. Below it, small block letters said, Project Kraken, Unit 4. There were hash marks worked into the shadows, too few to be decorative, too many to be vanity. Lawson stopped 2 paces off, boots together, chin tucked, the kind of posture to make young troops scan for a general. He didn't look at Ramirez. He didn't look at the audience. He looked at Reed's face, then at the buoy, then back to the ink. Ma'am, he said evenly, and then a breath lower sable. The call sign carried 30 years of rumor with it. Lawson's shoulders squared. He brought his hand up in a careful, formal salute. A few people chuckled at the old man saluting a senior airman. Those people weren't from around dogs or war. They quieted when Lawson spoke again, now loud enough to reach the cheap seats. For those of you who don't speak used-up kennel master, he said, eyes on Ramirez but words for everyone. Project Kraken isn't a patch you buy at the PX. It was the Ghost program that wrote the book on Tier 1 K9 breeding line, drive selection, bite science battlefield, tracking the voice work. Nobody teaches openly. Unit 4 trained in places that don't show up on the map. They deployed where cameras weren't invited, and when they came home, they didn't talk. He pointed, polite but unyielding. And Senior Airman Dana Reed, call sign Sable, helped build the bloodline that made Raptor possible. She's not here to spook your dog, Staff Sergeant. She's the reason you get to hold his leash. The crowd changed shape, arms folded, heads tipped. A few of the older vets near the back nodded with that slow, private smile of recognition that says, finally, someone told the whole story. Ramirez looked like he'd swallowed a key and could feel it stick halfway down. The microphone in his hand felt suddenly wrong. He set it on the post like it might burn through his palm. Sable, Lawson said softly to Reed, dropping the rank, but not the respect you want to take it from here. She didn't stand right away. She rubbed the bridge of Raptor's nose with the back of her knuckles, checked his pupils, the way a good handler checks a friend's eyes after a scare, then stood without a flourish. Her sleeve stayed up, the tattoo visible not as a trophy but as context. Thank you, Master Sergeant, she said, voice easy as shade afternoon. We can finish the demo. She turned to Ramirez, not smiling but not cold. If you're willing. He swallowed. Yes, ma'am, he said, and meant it. What followed wasn't a show. It was a class disguised as a second act. Reed didn't reach for the leash. She coached the man who held it. Stack your shoulders over your hips, she said quietly. Soften your knees. She placed 2 fingers on his wrist where the web of the glove met skin. Your pulse is loud down the lead. Raptor thinks something is about to happen. He's not aggressive. He's ready to defend you. Don't give him a threat to mirror. Ramirez adjusted. The difference looked like nothing, and it changed everything. Reed breathed in a square 4 and 4 hold, 4 out 4 hold, and made Ramirez do the same. She showed him where to let slack collect so the dog didn't feel the pressure as a question he had to answer. She had him step half a pace to his right so his hips and shoulders spoke a soft, "We are going this way," instead of a hard stop. Now watch his eyes, she said. He'll tell you what he's thinking before his muscles do. The second run was uneventful in a way that felt like success, not boredom. Raptor launched when asked, dropped when told, and returned with the rag knife like he'd been born with that. He didn't look for a place to put his confusion. He didn't have one. By the time Reed handed the microphone back, the crowd had stopped snickering and started listening. Lawson thanked the families for coming. Ramirez thanked Reed without the mic quietly, the way a man thanks a person who taught him something he should have known before he put on a uniform. The story could have ended there, good lesson, good day, good dog, but real change doesn't happen because strangers clap. It happens in the days after when nobody is looking for applause. The next morning, Ramirez knocked on the office door where Reed had been temporarily assigned. He didn't bring Raptor or a witness. He stepped in with his cap in his hands. Ma'am, he said, the word taller than it had been the day before. I owe you an apology. I was out of line. I was wrong about you, and I was wrong about what the dog needed. Reed set down the form she'd been signing and gave him her full attention. Thank you, she said. No lecture, no unwrapping of the obvious, just the kind of respect that makes a man want to keep earning it. He hesitated, then asked the thing that had kept him awake. How did you know? He shook his head, searching for words. It wasn't the command. Not really. It was before that. You saw it and I didn't. Reed leaned back, not to make distance, but to make room. You were broadcasting, she said simply. Down the leash across your shoulders in your voice. Raptor picked up your stress and answered it the only way he knows, be bigger than the problem. That's a good dog doing a bad job because his handler left the door open. Ramirez winced. She didn't let him sit in the shame. She slid a notepad across the desk and drew a simple square. Count with me, she said, tapping each side with the pen. 4 and 4 hold, 4 out, 4 hold. But it's not just breathing, it's what you do with the pause. He listened. She showed him how to step into that pause, how to feel the leash instead of gripping it, how to check the dog's tail set before the ears gave the game away, how to decide what do I want him to do instead of shouting, what do I want him to stop. She called it nothing at all. The unit 2 weeks later would call it the sable pause. They tried it in the yard first where the only stakes were pride and dirt. Then Lawson invited Reed to the night shift's bite house. She stood in the observation booth with the red light off and watched 4 teams run hot and hard. Between reps, she touched a shoulder, rotated a wrist, reset a stance. She didn't talk about her past. She talked about their dogs. The pause spread because it worked. Handlers who'd once framed success as power learned to measure it as clarity. The dogs stopped looking for threats that weren't there. The unit's Friday board, the one with weather kennel assignments, and the week's training scores grew another line near the bottom. Avoidable errors. The number slid from something you had to swallow to 0 for 2 Fridays, then 3. Lawson wrote a small check mark beside the 0 and didn't explain it. The base grapevine did what it does. At first, the tale was rehearsal room gossip. That admin chick shut down Raptor with one word. Then it matured. The day Ramirez met the architect got told in the weight room in the truck bay and on the duty desk after midnight when coffee tastes like burnt rope. The details shifted at the edges. The core stayed true. A quiet professional walked into a loud space, spoke softly to a dog and a man, and the room learned something it didn't know it needed. Lawson never corrected the parts the tellers didn't get right. He let the story do the work because the thing it was working on was bigger than a single handler's pride. He did pin one laminated card by the kennel door printed on the same cheap stock as the Chow Hall menu, Sable Paws. Under the heading 4 short lines, breathe in a square. Stack your frame. Slack speaks, let it. Ask the behavior you want. He taped one more card next to it. No explanation. Just a sentence, arrogance is loud. Competence is silent. Nobody signed it. Nobody had to. By the second month, the changes were visible even to people who thought a slip lead was a kind of seatbelt. The runs looked cleaner, the commands were fewer, and the ones you did hear were honest. In public demos, the dogs read the handler's calm and returned it like a favor. A visiting state trooper watched one session and said, "Looks like you folks stopped a fight in the river and started reading it." The unit's most skeptical sergeant, a man who had built a career on volume, stopped Reed in the hall and then asked if she had a minute. She had 30. He walked away with his index finger tapped along his pulse point like a reminder, slow down before you speed up. Reed never told war stories. She didn't use her call sign unless Lawson made the introduction formal. The tattoo on her forearm wasn't a flag she waved, it was a history she carried. A few of the older handlers asked careful questions. Was Project Kraken as wild as we heard? She smiled and said, Wilder then changed the subject to why a dog's head carriage tells you more than his tail. Once very late, Lawson asked her directly. They'd finished a night run and were sitting on the low platform behind the bite house boots, touching the dirt, breathing steam into the cold. What was Unit 4 like, he said. Reed watched their breath drift. Small, she said. Smart. Quiet. We went where there wasn't a plan yet and left one behind. Dogs like Raptor, Lawson asked. She shook her head. Not like before. The line was still growing, teeth still figuring out which ones we needed. We learned a lot we wish we'd never had to, but it kept other people from learning it the hard way. She paused and looked toward the dark where the kennels hummed. That's enough story for me. He didn't push. People who hold other people's ghosts don't owe you more. When the base commander hosted a civilian group 2 months later, Lawson asked Reed to stand behind the fence and watch the handlers work. She stood beside a grandmother in a church sweatshirt and talked about how to read a dog's posture without scaring the dog or the grandmother. She didn't mention Kraken or Sable or the places between. The grandmother left with a new respect for canine patience and for the young men and women holding leashes. Not everything was a victory lap. One afternoon, a junior handler named Ortega came in hot after a long day and blew it in the first 60 seconds. Voice too sharp, leash too short, dog too confused to know which wrong to fix. Ortega stomped out red-eyed and didn't come back after the 10-minute cooldown. Reed found him in the alley behind the kennels with his hand braced on the block wall, counting like a drowning man. "Walk with me," she said. They went around the perimeter once without talking. On the second lap, she asked, "What did your dog think you wanted?" "Everything," Ortega said miserably. "And what did you want?" she asked. He laughed without humor. "I wanted him to forgive me for being tired." She nodded. "Tell him what you want instead." "One thing, one good thing." They ran the drill again. Ortega breathed. The dog breathed with him because that's what dogs do when you let them. They finished 10 minutes later with a clean out and a tail thump against Ortega's shin that sounded like forgiveness landing. The photograph that became the unit's icon arrived in the least official way. A supply tech with a halfway decent eye caught Reed's hands open in her lap and a raptor's head pressed into them. The tech printed the shot on a cheap color printer and thumbtacked it to the bulletin board. Someone wrote the motto underneath in Sharpie. Lawson laminated it because some things deserve to last longer than paper usually does. If you'd walked the hallway a year later, you would have seen the photo of the Sable Paws card and a weekly board that didn't brag but didn't apologize about zero avoidables. You would have seen two words chalked small on the whiteboard under safety notes, "Listen first." You would also have noticed something quieter. The unit had stopped searching for heroes to clap for and started building standards to live by. When a handler drifted towards his showmanship, another handler cleared his throat, not shaming, just reminding. When a new troop tried to fake confidence with volume, a senior tapped the laminated card and said, "Try the pause." The culture didn't flip overnight. It shifted one breath at a time. Reed's temporary assignment ended the way it began, without ceremony. She stopped by Lawson's office with a manila envelope of paperwork in a small box. In the box was a length of worn leather and a slip lead old enough to be a story. It wasn't hers, she explained. It had been given to her by a handler whose dog had taught her more than any human ever had. "Seems like it belongs to the school now," she said. Lawson lifted the lead and felt the ghost of other dogs in the softness. "We'll use it right," he said, "or we won't use it at all." Ramirez walked her to the parking lot. Raptor wasn't with him. The dog was sleeping off a long training day with his ribs gently expanding like a metronome. The handler who had mocked a paper pusher looked like a man who had been given back a piece of himself he didn't know he'd lost. "I wanted to say thank you," he said, "for not making a point out of me." "You made your own point," Reed said, soft enough that he had to lean in. "You showed up the next day. I've seen men with bigger stripes do less." He smiled, then lost it. "Does it ever stop feeling like you don't know enough?" She looked at the sun on the hood of her car and then at him. "No, that's how you know you're doing it right." He nodded, filed that sentence somewhere safe, and squeezed her hand once. A brother's grip, not a subordinate's. She drove away with no escort and no crowd. The kennel yard went back to its hum, the sound of smart dogs and clean runs of brooms on concrete of water filled and buckets stacked. The photo on the board didn't fade as fast as photos usually do. People took care to replace it when the colors washed out. New handlers were told the story on day one by people who had lived it, the day Ramirez met the architect. But by then, it wasn't an embarrassment. It was a credential. You couldn't teach humility with a memo. You could teach it with a man who learned in public and stayed. Ramirez made a habit of introducing himself to new troops by telling that very story and then asking them what they were most worried about. The answers changed. The worries didn't. That was fine. People don't stay because the fear goes away. They stay because the work makes sense. Once a month, Lawson held a 10-minute open kennel after lunch. No agenda, no slides. He asked for one lesson learned, whatever the rank. Sometimes it was a tip about keeping pads uncracked in winter. Sometimes it was a confession about messing up a bite because pride got in the way. More often than not, someone brought up the pause not as a technique, but as a habit that made the rest of the work possible. Reed's name didn't always come up. It didn't need to. The legacy had already left her hands and moved into theirs. If you're of a certain age, all of this might feel familiar. You know what it means when a unit stops looking for heroes and starts building adults. You've seen the difference between noise and signal, and you can feel a room's pulse in your thumb when you set it there. You also know that most of the people worth following never asked to be followed in the first place. Hank Lawson retired a year after Reed left. He cleaned out his office, packed the framed photos that mattered, and left the rest. Before he turned in his badge and gate pass, he walked the kennel hallway one last time. He stopped in front of the laminated photo. He touched Raptor's printed ear like you might touch a child's hat on a rack before you close the door. Then he wrote 3 words very small in the bottom corner with a fine tip marker. Do this well. He didn't sign that either. If you came to the base a year later with your grandchildren, you would have seen another demo. Different handler, different dog. Same run, same dummy, same weathered bite sleeve. No theatrics, just a quiet conversation between a person and a partner who knows how to listen. You might have asked why the show felt different from the ones on television. A sergeant with scuffed boots would have smiled and pointed to the laminated card by the gate. You'd read the 4 lines and nod because the best lessons always make sense before you finish them. On your way out, if you paused by the bulletin board, you'd see the motto under the photo and think it was meant for dogs. You'd be right. You'd also be shortchanging it. That line, arrogance is loud, competence is silent, is good for a leash hand, for a marriage, for a toolbox, for a Tuesday. It's good for a backyard gate that squeaks and a neighbor who talks too much. It's good for an old Marine with a scar left over from a piece of shrapnel, and for the young officer learning how to brief without hiding behind slides. Dana Reed never came back for a ceremony. There wasn't one. She left something better than a plaque. She left a way. The unit kept it because it worked. And on a base where wind slaps the flag and jet wash comes and goes, quiet holds longer than anyone expects. There's one more detail, small but worth keeping. In the bottom drawer of Lawson's old desk, because not every drawer gets cleaned to the back, someone found a scratched brass tag the size of a silver dollar. No hole for a chain, just letters stamped by hand. Kraken 4, Sable. Listen first. They taped it under the photograph, not like a trophy, but like a reminder. New handlers touched it once lightly, the way ball players tap a sign on their way to the field. Nobody talked about what it meant. They didn't have to. A good standard does its work without an advertisement. If you ever find yourself on a hard day with a leash in your hand, whatever your leash happens to be, remember what Reed taught by standing still. Breathe in a square. Stack your frame. Let slack speak. Ask clearly for the one right thing. Then do it again tomorrow. That's how dogs learn. That's how units change. That's how quiet turns into trust, and trust turns into work you can be proud of when the crowd goes home.